everyone, and welcome to York Festival of Ideas. My name is Sarah King, and I'm the Curator of Natural Sciences at the Yorkshire Museum right here in York. I'll be chairing the event this evening, so thank you for joining us, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you all here. There's about 50 people here now, so hopefully that number will grow a bit, so we're up for a great evening tonight. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Mark P Witton. He is a paleontologist, author and artist based at the University of Portsmouth in the UK. He designs and advises on extinct creatures for films and documentaries, including the hit Apple TV Plus, I don't have it, sorry, series Prehistoric Planet, hugely popular. I'm clearly the only person who hasn't seen it. And his artwork is widely featured in books and museums around the world. So this evening, Mark is going to talk to us about the king of the dinosaurs, Tyrannosaurus Rex. So Mark, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thanks everyone for tuning in to see the talk. I'm really excited to be talking to you today because we're talking about my new book, King Tyrant: A Natural History of Tyrannosaurus Rex. I'm excited because I've been working on this book for a number of years, and it's just nice to be able to finally start to be able to talk to people about it, because I think this is a really exciting project. We all like Tyrannosaurus, but it's amazing how few books there are about this animal. So in this talk, we're going to talk a little bit about the book and about T-Rex itself. And I'm in a really fortunate position in that I don't have to introduce you to what Tyrannosaurus is, because you already know what T-Rex is. We know about Tyrannosaurus for the same reason that we know about things like elephants and lions. We're exposed to it from a variety of media at a very young age, and then we just sort of accept it as part of natural history. You know, we just sort of know that it existed on our planet 66 million years ago. We know sort of the general things about T-Rex. We know it's really, really big. We know it's about, to put a number on that, it's over 12 meters long. So the biggest specimens are about 12.4 meters long. Of course, there's a very large head with those characteristic spike-like teeth. And of course, there's also those famously small forelimbs that end in only 2 fingers. So we all know what Tyrannosaurus is. And I think what's really interesting about this animal is that although it's been extinct for 66 million years, you can show anyone a picture of it and they know what it is. It's that recognizable and it's that iconic. There really aren't many dinosaurs that we can do that for. And I think if you were to ask people, you know, what do they think of Tyrannosaurus? What do they know about it? I think they'd probably say that it's a good chance it's their favorite theropod dinosaur. And what I mean by a theropod is the predatory dinosaur group. So this is the same group that gave us things like Velociraptor, Tyrannosaurus, and of course also the birds, which are the living dinosaurs. So birds, of course, are part of that same lineage that gave us these big hulking things like T-Rex and Allosaurus. And of course, that means that they're surviving dinosaurs that live among us today. So in addition to being the world's favorite theropod, what else does everyone know about T-Rex? Well, they probably know that it lived, as we've already said, 66 million years ago at the end of the Cretaceous period. So this is the last period of the Mesozoic era, or the age of reptiles. And it's a dinosaur that stems from Western North America. So you can find T-Rex fossils all the way from southwest Canada down almost potentially into Mexico. And there's a little bit of uncertainty about what some of those southerlymost T-Rexes might actually be. Are they T-Rex or something else? But it's definitely got a very wide geographic distribution. And it lives alongside animals like Triceratops and Edmontosaurus, and it's part of a very famous end Cretaceous dinosaur fauna. And of course, this is featured all the time in documentaries. There's no end of, in fact, Walking with Dinosaurs just a couple of weekends ago started. Everyone also knows that Tyrannosaurus lived by virtue of being alive at the end of the Mesozoic era. It faced that big mass extinction event that wiped out all of the non-bird dinosaurs. So this, of course, is the asteroid-induced extinction that perhaps extinguished about 75% of species on Earth at the time. So this is one of the biggest extinction events in the history of our planet, and T-Rex was right there. So the southernmost T-Rexes are actually quite close to that impact, and they would have been experiencing some pretty awful things that day. That was a really awful day for the history of life on Earth. Something I get into the book. We're not going to talk too much about it now, but it's definitely something we associate with T-Rex. It's alive at the end of the Cretaceous and witnesses this huge extinction. And maybe the final thing we all know about Tyrannosaurus is that just how popular it is. This is the most discussed, most illustrated, most animated, most sought after, and most merchandised dinosaur of all time. It's in every single dinosaur film. It's in every single dinosaur documentary. There's countless books for children written for it. You can't get away from T-Rex. All of the images that have scrolled up on the screen in front of you on this slide were posted to the internet in the last sort of 3 days or so. And this is just a fraction of all the T-Rex content that has been uploaded to the internet in half a week. We just cannot stop talking about T-Rex. And so the interesting thing for me as an author, so I write books for a living, I write and illustrate books for a living. And when I'm thinking about what books to do next, I sometimes look at what's out there, what's available. And for T-Rex, you might think, well, gosh, this thing has surely been covered a lot in books already, right? Because if you go to a dinosaur fan's bookshelf, and I'm really thinking about maybe that slightly more sort of older dinosaur fans, so not necessarily for children, but I'm thinking about that slightly older dinosaur enthusiast, let's say. And you might think, wow, well, look at this, there's loads of books on T-Rex. When you start looking at what those books actually cover, it's amazing how many of them just use Tyrannosaurus as sort of a hook to get you interested in the book, and maybe it's actually about something else. And so things like The Monster's Bones is actually a biography of a fossil hunter. Tyrannosaurus Sue is a book about the legal battle over a Tyrannosaurus specimen. It's not really about T-Rex itself. There's a book called Starring T-Rex, which is about dinosaur pop culture. Those two big books at the bottom, Tyrannosaurid Biology and Tyrannosaurus Rex, these are academic books. So these are actually books that are full of scientific papers. They're not something that you can just take off your shelf and read from end to end, unless you're basically a dinosaur researcher who's really, really interested in Tyrannosaurus and its relatives. And so the closest thing that actually exists to a book on the world's most popular dinosaur is the Tyrannosaur Chronicles by a friend of mine, David Hone. And this is a great book, but it talks about tyrannosaurs in general. It looks at the whole picture of the tyrannosaur lineage. If you want a book specifically about Tyrannosaurus, there's actually only been one published in the last, basically in my lifetime. I turned 40 last year. This book is The Complete T-Rex by the famous paleontologist Jack Horner and his co-author Don Lessem. And this book is not new. This book, in fact, we have to go all the way back to 1993 for when this book was published. Now, 1993 feels like a long time ago. If you weren't alive at that time, or if you were alive but you've forgotten what it looked like, this is 1993 in a nutshell. Very, very different time culturally, and also a different time scientifically. So what Horner and Lessem cannot have predicted, then they don't have the power to know what's going to happen next in dinosaur science. They could not have predicted that just a couple of years after they published their book, things are going to go crazy about Tyrannosaurus. There's going to be some significant events, not only scientifically for Tyrannosaurus, it's going to become this intensely studied fossil species, but also there's going to be a bunch of stuff that happens in the sort of the cultural side of Tyrannosaurus as well. And we're going to see some really significant events about the sort of the value of T-Rex fossils. And so in a way, they published their book at almost exactly the wrong time, and there was no way they could have known this. I'm not sort of having, not criticizing them. It's just one of those things that happened. They sort of missed out on this big craze of T-Rex that was about to happen. And so, of course, as I said, I'm thinking about this as an author and artist, and what can I do a book on? Where are the holes in the market? And I'm thinking, well, where's our big T-Rex book? Where's the book that tells you everything you want to know about the world's most popular dinosaur? And so this is the book that I've just written. This aims to be a very thorough assessment of Tyrannosaurus, not only in terms of its scientific aspect, that's really the focus of the book, but there is also a large chunk of the book devoted to its, what you might call its human history. So where its role in sort of popular culture and our interactions with it, with its fossils over the last 120 years. I wanted to create a book that was accessible, but also something that was comprehensive in detail. So this is a book that if you're a dinosaur enthusiast, you can go to, and you've got that meat of detail that you feel that you've got an understanding of a topic. And if you're really keen, you can use the references in the book to move on to the next level of dinosaur nerdery, which is to go and have a look at the technical papers, the primary scientific literature, and you can find all of that referenced throughout the book. I'm also an illustrator and an artist, and so I wanted to fill this book with images of Tyrannosaurus that you've never seen before. And this is something that's kind of a challenge to do because T-Rex is illustrated, as we saw a few slides ago, it's illustrated again and again and again. But I wanted to breathe some new life into Tyrannosaurus artwork. So hopefully, if you're a dedicated T-Rex diehard, you're still flicking through this and thinking, gosh, there's things in here that I've never seen before. New diagrams, new paintings, new photographs of T-Rex specimens. Another goal of the book, though, I'm thinking about the creative ethos of the book. I wanted this to be very much T-Rex as it was understood by science, but I also didn't want to ignore the T-Rex that is known to the public. And the challenge we have with this is that this is quite a kind of stereotyped and cliched animal. But I didn't want to just sort of pretend that didn't exist. I wanted to fully embrace that. And the reason for that is because it's really difficult to divorce the T-Rex of science from the T-Rex of popular culture. And there's lots of reasons we can really get into the minutiae of that. I mean, it's in essence because T-Rex is just everywhere, and there's so much gray area between the science of Tyrannosaurus and the popular culture version. Of course, when we're thinking about pop culture T-Rex, we're really thinking about the Jurassic Park interpretation, which is this is the version of T-Rex that most people think of when they imagine Tyrannosaurus. So when they're not thinking about the version that scientists imagine, they're thinking about this thing that burst from its paddock in 1993 and started ramping. And this is actually not too bad an interpretation of Tyrannosaurus, and particularly in that first film, there's some nice aspects of what you might call animalistic behavior in there. But over time, even within this franchise, the Tyrannosaurus has become more and more monsterized. And this is the version of Tyrannosaurus that as scientists, I think we're sort of butting our head up against sometimes, where we're having to compete with it in a way to for not only people's attention, but also to get them to understand what Tyrannosaurus was really like as an animal. When you're a science communicator, what you find a lot of the time is that the versions of paleontological species that exist in popular culture are so dominant in people's minds that when you give a talk about these creatures, you have to sort of untangle and unpack the sort of the version that they've picked up from cinema and from comic books, etc. And you have to say that's not really what we think these things were like at all. And so you spend a lot of your time trying to disentangle that version rather than talking about all the neat science that you really want to convey. And this is a particular problem for Tyrannosaurus because of the hype that surrounds it. There's sort of a filter that comes across it. People just get so excited when they hear about it, and they just assume that it's going to be the big monster that they know of from cinema and from video games and from comic books, rather than the version they know from science. And that gray area does actually extend into the scientific media as well. So there's lots of documentaries about Tyrannosaurus that feature people who dig up their bones, who feature paleontologists, and some of the science that they talk about, a lot of it is a little bit spurious. I'm not going to say it's necessarily bad science, but it's certainly things that if you go into the literature about this animal, you go into the scientific discourse around Tyrannosaurus, there are lots of these topics that actually maybe the science isn't quite as solid as is implied in documentaries. And in other cases, there are certainly things that have been abandoned and chucked out the window as far as mainstream science goes. They have been discredited. But the problem is, of course, is that when these things are continually perpetuated in documentaries and in popular science articles, they have a long sort of half-life. They take a long time to disappear from people's understanding. So these two things together really, they make a filter that we have to get through to get to the real T-Rex. And so I didn't want to ignore that in the book. I wanted to actually discuss it and make sure that people are aware of some of these challenges. And the last thing we can't ignore when talking about Tyrannosaurus in a sort of a cultural sense is about its impact on the value of fossils. And I'm talking here specifically about monetary value. And what's interesting is that if you read your historic dinosaur literature from the 1970s and 1980s backwards, no one really talks about the monetary value of fossils. This is something that has really only begun to occur in the last sort of 30 years or so, and that the event that caused this was the sale of this Tyrannosaurus specimen that you're looking at here. This is the famous T-Rex known as Sue. Sue is on display in Chicago. Sue is just a pet name. We don't know what sex Sue the Tyrannosaurus actually was. It's named after the person who discovered it. But Sue went up for sale in 1997. It was sold for over $8 million. And from that moment on, anyone with a Tyrannosaurus on their property was potentially sitting on a gold mine. This is something that could be taken out of the ground and sold for hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. And T-Rexes are now selling for over $30 million. That's the most that's ever been paid for a Tyrannosaurus. That's not the most that's ever been paid for a fossil specimen. The record for that is over 40 million, which was for a Stegosaurus specimen, I think last year. My my guess on this is that Stegosaurus won't hold the record for most expensive dinosaur specimen ever sold for very long, and that the next Tyrannosaurus that comes onto the market, the next sort of substantial, decent, decent specimen of T-Rex will probably make more than that even. And this is a problem. I don't want to pretend that this is something that we should just be kind of cool about and fine with. Those sorts of values are just way above anything that a museum can afford, and it's pushing the many of these specimens into a realm where just they're going to be beyond science, beyond public access. And so this is definitely a conversation to have around dinosaurs and around Tyrannosaurus in particular, because the data set is potentially going to start shrinking in terms of the proportion of ownership of T-Rex in public in the public domain, while the private sector is set to increase and increase and increase. That's not what our talk is about, but it's definitely something that we have to engage with when we're talking about Tyrannosaurus in a cultural sense. What I would like to talk to you about really is the science of T-Rex, because this is my interest. So my background is in paleontology, so I'm really interested in dinosaurs for what they're like as animals. And the way that we look at Tyrannosaurus now is to consider it as a model organism. And what I mean by that is it's a species that has been looked at again and again with lots of different investigative methods. We've looked at every single component of its anatomy inside and out. And we've developed this very detailed picture of its of what it is like as an animal. And so this is something that we do for many species. So of course we do it for living species as well, things like lab rats, things like Drosophila fruit flies. And we aim to make them into what we call these model organisms, where we have a really robust understanding of everything about them. And it means that we can then use them to start understanding other members of the same group. So we can use Drosophila to start understanding other insects. We can use rats to start understanding other mammals. And so what does it mean to be a model organism for a dinosaur? Well, it means understanding the anatomy inside and out. So we're not just talking about the external appearance of the bones, but we're looking at them inside as well. We're looking at what happens to those bones when they get old and when they get diseased. We're looking at what other anatomy might we have that the fossil record has provided us with. So things like skin, or any remnants of other organs like the brain case and this sort of thing. Once we have that base layer of anatomy, we can start looking at those missing anatomical components that can be strongly inferred from the skeleton. So things like dinosaur lungs can be reconstructed with some detail from aspects of their vertebral column. We can look at the musculature and get an idea of where the muscles attach based on the shapes of the bones and the attachment sites for and muscle scars. We can also have a look at things like brain structure. We can augment all of that with what we call trace fossils. So whereas a bone is what we call a body fossil, it's a remnant of the animal's body tissues, a trace fossil is something that was left by the animal when it was alive. So it's something like a footprint, or it's fossilized feces, or a bite mark that's been left in something. We can build that out even further, and we start moving away from sort of the gross anatomy of the species, and we start thinking more about the animal as a functioning biological unit. We start thinking about things like physiology, and what we mean by that is what was it? How energetic was this animal? How was it warm-blooded or cold-blooded? How much did it weigh? What was it like? What was its growth rate? How fast did it grow? Can we talk about functional morphology? How strong were the bones? How far could they move? So we start to not think about this just as a sort of a set of fossil bones that we can understand anatomically, but we start thinking about how it actually moves and works as a biological being. And from there, we can start to build out into what I think is what people are sometimes really interested in with dinosaurs. They want to know about behavior and ecology. So how fast could this thing move? How strong did it bite? What was it eating? How did it reproduce? Did it live in a group with other animals, or did it live on its own? And so it's only once we build up that kind of core of information about anatomy and the sort of the base physiology that we can really start thinking more about behavior and ecology and start trying to make some sensible inferences about that. And all of this has to be considered within a wider evolutionary and geological context. And so what we mean by that is, what animals are our subject species related to, or what organisms, I should say, is our subject species related to? Where do they fit into the tree of life, and where, and how did their characteristic features develop? We can think about where they fit in the geological record. How old are they? How long was the species around for? What sort of environments did they live in? And in some cases, we can ask the question of, why did they go extinct? This isn't something that we can talk about very much with fossil animals, but we can in some cases answer the question of, why aren't they around today? And the reason T-Rex is so good for this is because we have lots and lots of specimens of them. And this is something that's unusual for large carnivorous dinosaurs. So there's some large dinosaur herbivores, and we have thousands of them. But for carnivorous dinosaurs, particularly really big ones, we actually don't have that many specimens for most species. Tyrannosaurus is an exception, because we have, if you're counting everything from the most complete specimens down to isolated teeth and bones, we have maybe 1,500 specimens in museums and collections around the world. So we've got really a good data set for them. And what's nice about T-Rex is that of those 1,500 bones, for 1,500 specimens, I should say, a lot of them are fairly substantial, relatively complete specimens. So we range from the Sioux tyrannosaur that we spoke about earlier. Almost every single bone is known in that skeleton. There's a few bits missing from the tail and from the hand, but virtually all of that specimen is known. And while Sioux is a particularly complete Tyrannosaurus, there are a number of other specimens that offer relatively high levels of completeness. So you're just missing maybe a set of legs, or you've got most of the temporal column, but maybe you're missing the head or something like that. And because we have all of that, this is a great animal to do science on. It means that there's specimens of them in lots of different museums. It means there's lots of ways to really start interrogating different specimens in different ways. So having a good data set is really good for Tyrannosaurus. The other thing that we can do with T-Rex that makes it an excellent model organism is understand its anatomy inside out. And so we've actually done this. There are lots and lots of descriptive papers of Tyrannosaurus, including complete osteologies that show what every single bone looks like in multiple views. And this provides us with a map of the bony anatomy of Tyrannosaurus that we just don't have for all dinosaurs, and particularly not for all large carnivorous dinosaurs. And this just means that we can really start to understand this thing from a functional perspective. We know what all the shapes of the bones are, so we can identify stress points. We can look at the skull and how that all fits together, and start to get an idea of what happens when this thing bites. Does this skull actually move at all? We can understand how deep the teeth go into the sockets. All that kind of anatomical information that we might want about T-Rex, we have, because we have the good specimens, and many of them are really nicely preserved, uncrushed, undistorted. By having so many T-Rexes and understanding their anatomy in so much detail, we can look at their variation. And this is something that might sound a little bit dull. You're just like, well, everything, animal species vary. If you look at two different animals of the two different individuals of the same species, they obviously aren't necessarily identical. But this is essential to understanding what organisms are like, and particularly for taxonomy, for reasons that we'll discuss later on. We can look at variation in a couple of ways. The first is just to see how these individuals vary in their build. So we can say that, are there sort of gracile and robust Tyrannosauruses, or is there a spectrum between them? And this is useful for us to know, because it gives us a sense of just how much variation there is within the species. And we can use that to identify when something is a T-Rex or when something might be a different species. But the really interesting part about understanding variation comes with growth, because we're now learning that Tyrannosaurus looked really different throughout its lifespan, and that juvenile T-Rexes were surprisingly gracile, slender-snouted, and leggy animals that had longer arms, relatively speaking, than the big adults did. So when we imagine Tyrannosaurus, we always think of the really big ones, the really big multi-ton, large-headed, small-armed predators. But as juveniles, they looked really, really different. And that's something we're only just now starting to get a handle on. And yeah, it all comes from just having so many T-Rex specimens where we can start to get an idea of things like their growth and how much they vary throughout their lifespans. The final criterion for making T-Rex into a model organism is doing the best kind of science with it, which is by going back to T-Rex again and again and again with the same question, but approaching it with a different technique and a different methodology. The reason we need to do this is because an important part of science is repetition, and it's about going back to make sure that the results of previous studies hold up when we look at them in a different light. And we've done that a lot with T-Rex. We've done that for several different topics. We've done it with their running or walking speed. We've looked at their bite force many, many times. We've looked at their growth rate several times. What all of this means is that we're starting to get a really good handle on some of these aspects about T-Rex. And it means that we're able to, if you like, field test some of our techniques that we want to apply to other dinosaurs on a species that we know really, really well. So that means that we have this really good understanding of what Tyrannosaurus is like, and we can now probably say something intelligent about most aspects of its biology, which is not something we can say for most extinct animals, let alone most dinosaurs. And what I mean by say something intelligent about it is that we may not have all the answers, but we're able to exclude at least some possibilities. We can kind of narrow the realm of uncertainty around around most topics. Even if we can't say exactly what's going on, we can at least say, well, it probably isn't that. And that's a very useful thing to be able to do, because it means that we're only going to narrow that scope of uncertainty even more as we go back again and again and again to that species. And so how can we apply some of this understanding, some of the understanding we've built up around T-Rex as a model organism to some questions we might have about predatory dinosaurs and Tyrannosaurus? And there's no question about T-Rex that is asked more than, was T-Rex the largest theropod? And we can get the size of T-Rex, certainly the linear dimensions of it, very reliably, because we have those very complete specimens that we already alluded to. And so we just, to get the length or the height of a T-Rex, really all we have to do is put the skeleton together, and then we get the tape measure out. So it's actually quite an easy thing to do. And we know that for T-Rex, that's about 12 and a half meters long in a really big specimen. In terms of mass, we think that Tyrannosaurus might be somewhere in the 6 to 8 ton range, maybe pushing 9 in particularly big animals. So if that's your Tyrannosaurus, well, what about the other contenders? Because we all know that T-Rex is definitely up there with the big predatory dinosaurs, but what about the other ones? Well, there's an animal called Giganotosaurus from South America. There's quite a famous dinosaur. Many of you may be familiar with it. This is an animal that's estimated to be maybe 13 meters long, but might be a bit heavier than T-Rex, maybe 8 to 10 tons. And then the Spinosaurus from Cretaceous rocks of Egypt, which again might be even bigger again. We're looking at an animal that's maybe 14 to 15 meters long at its maximum size, and of a similar sort of mass, like 8 to 9 ton area. But the question is, how reliable is any of this? It's very easy just to give these figures to you and to say that's it. There's our answer. So maybe we'll say Giganotosaurus just edges it. But the reality of this is that actually it's very difficult to put an answer confidently on this very simple question of which one was the biggest. And the reason for this is that the largest specimens of other non-Tyrannosaurus theropods are very, very piecemeal. They're very, very patchy. So on the left-hand side of the screen there, you have this is the biggest specimen of Giganotosaurus, and it may not be immediately obvious what it is. It is the front of a lower jaw, and this is the biggest specimen we have of it. There is another specimen of Giganotosaurus, which is a slightly smaller animal, and that's a partial skeleton. It's nowhere near complete. It's a partial skeleton, and the question is this single jaw fragment, which is clearly bigger than the other specimen we have, but is that just a particularly robust individual, or is it something that was genuinely bigger? We don't know is the honest answer to that. It's very difficult to say with just those two specimens how big Giganotosaurus was and how much bigger those two specimens would be what the size difference is between those two specimens. So Giganotosaurus may have been bigger than T-Rex, but the honest answer is we don't really know for certain how big it was. The situation is slightly better for Spinosaurus, but as many of you may know, the Spinosaurus is on the right-hand side of the screen, I should say. So there's several specimens, and you might think, okay, Spinosaurus, we're getting a bit more of a handle on it. We have to remember that 2 of those specimens were destroyed in the Second World War. So actually, we're left with those other 2 specimens on the screen there, which is a partial skeleton and a big upper jaw. Again, how big is this animal? It's a little bit difficult to say when the biggest specimen you have is just the front half of a skull. And so answering how big are these animals is actually very, very tricky. So answering that simple question, which is the biggest, we don't know. But let's return to T-Rex. The really useful thing about having so many T-Rex specimens and also having people going back to T-Rex again and again to investigate its mass is that we've actually got a pretty good handle on how big Tyrannosaurus is, definitely compared to other dinosaurs. And this may not sound like a big deal, but actually estimating the mass, and by mass, of course, we're talking about kilogrammage. We're talking about how many tons does T-Rex weigh, which is the best way of assessing size in fossil animals. By going back to mass again and again, what we're finding is that Tyrannosaurus was, as an adult, between that sort of 6 to 8 ton area, maybe pushing a little bit above that as old adults. This is really, really useful for us because it actually ground truths our methods for estimating the masses of other animals. So potentially we can apply some of these methodologies to other non-Tyrannosaurus species and get a better appreciation for what sorry, I've got a few error messages coming up. We might get a better idea of what Tyrannosaurus was like, so of what dinosaur mass was like in general, because of the ground truthing that we've done on T-Rex. So this is a really useful thing for us to do. And while it might seem like a bit of a cop-out that we can't say which is the biggest theropod, actually getting a handle on how big T-Rex is a very useful thing in its own right. And we can also, because we have that nice big data set of T-Rex, we can apply some ideas of sort of population diversity. So thinking, well, how big could T-Rex get? Because in any animal population, there are always those individuals which are much, much bigger. They're sort of those 0.01% of the population that they just get enormous. We all have a friend or a colleague, and they just stand, many, many inches above us. Those individuals exist across animal populations. We can calculate what that may have been for Tyrannosaurus because we have that nice big sample size. And what we think is that while the biggest fossil specimens we have of Tyrannosaurus are maybe that 12.5-ish meter long range, maybe there were some very rare individuals that got even bigger, much, much bigger, in fact, 16 to 17 meters long, maybe 13 tons. So really super big giant T-Rexes may have existed. And there's all sorts of stuff we could talk about them in terms of their changes in proportion. They're not just going to be a scaled up version of a smaller T-Rex. They're going to be different again to the adults that we know of from the fossil record. Another area that we have a very good understanding of for T-Rex is its locomotion. And there's lots we can say about this because it's been studied again and again over the last 120 years. And it was actually apparent to people as soon as T-Rex was discovered. And we're looking here in the early 20th century. So T-Rex bones start coming out of the ground and are identified as a big theropod dinosaur in the early 1900s. And what we find with those early interpretations of T-Rex is no one's doing any kind of complicated biomechanics or anything, but they're looking at the size of the hips and they're looking at the slenderness and the length of the legs. And they're looking at things like the gracility of the foot. A Tyrannosaurus has got a very compressed foot, which is a feature of a fast moving animal. And they're putting all of this together and they're saying, well, this thing might be 12 meters long, but it could probably move pretty quickly for an animal of that size. The question has been, of course, is that can we actually start to put some numbers on that? And people have gone back to this again and again and again. And what we found is that similarly as with mass estimation, by returning to the problem repeatedly, we've actually got some pretty a bit of a consensus forming about how fast Tyrannosaurus can move. And we're thinking that as an adult, Tyrannosaurus is maybe moving at about 25 to 30 kilometers an hour. So sort of about 15 to 18 miles an hour. That makes it a bit more relatable, which doesn't sound enormously quick, but we'll put an asterisk next to that and come back in a moment. I think to emphasize, though, is that as those longer limbed juveniles, Tyrannosaurus is probably moving much, much faster. So as a large juvenile, where they're sort of in they're just about to get into their teenage years, if you like, they may be moving at more like, sort of 40, 50 kilometers an hour. So they're moving much, much faster. And what's nice about this, again, is that we just have this agreement that this is how quick T-Rex is moving. This is not something to be taken for granted when you're looking at something as potentially controversial as locomotion in an extinct animal. There are lots of extinct animals don't even know how they move necessarily, let alone how fast they're moving. But T-Rex is that model organism. We've got a pretty good idea just from repeated study. But we mentioned that Tyrannosaurus may not be that fast. And of course, the caveat with this is that T-Rex isn't looking to impress us with breaking some sort of running speed record or anything like that. All T-Rex has to do is move faster than the things it wants to eat. And by applying principles of biomechanics, we have a pretty good idea of how T-Rex may have done that. And this is all to do with simple leverage. And we're talking here about the leverage of the muscle that pulls the hind limb back. So if you look on a dinosaur thigh bone, or the bone that we call the femur, there's a little knob on the back that we call the fourth trochanter, and it's sometimes quite a big, prominent structure. This anchors a muscle that runs onto the tail. We call the cauda femoralis. Don't worry too much about the name. The important thing is that muscle that anchors on the tail is a big hind limb retractor. It pulls the leg back when it contracts. So this is an important muscle for a running dinosaur. If it wants to move quick, it needs to have a nice big cauda femoralis, and that's what we find occurs in T-Rex. It's really, really big. But what we notice is that in Tyrannosaurus, the way that muscle works on the hind limb is different to how it works in its prey. In the fourth trochanter is located quite high up on the thigh bone. What this means is that it's actually more effort for that muscle to pull the leg back. It's the leverage isn't quite so good, but the trade-off is that while it's putting extra effort in, it's going to move the leg much quicker. This is just the simple laws of levers that you understand that we study in physics classes at GCSE. So we're getting a high effort but rapid movement of the legs in Tyrannosaurus. What we notice in prey species, and these are things that we know T-Rex ate, what we notice in prey species is that that lever is located much further down on the leg. So we're getting the opposite effect. We're getting a more efficient muscle contraction where it's not having to work quite as hard, but the leg isn't moving quite as far nor quite as fast. And so what we're thinking, when we apply this to a question of like, well, how did T-Rex hunt its prey? By having a high energy but fast moving set of hind limbs, we're thinking that Tyrannosaurus is more of an ambusher. So it's not necessarily running after things. And one thing I would emphasize is that T-Rex cannot run in the sense of having both its legs off the ground as an adult anyway. So it's not sort of sprinting after things. It's more sort of power walking. But it's doing that at a high speed over a short distance. Whereas the prey species, their strategy for running away from Tyrannosaurus probably isn't so much about top speed, it's more about endurance. So they're hoping to identify the Tyrannosaurus early, and they're hoping to get ahead of the ambush and outlast T-Rex in a foot race rather than outpace it. And what I really like about that is that this is the kind of question that we all want to know the answers to. What was T-Rex like as a predator? And what's neat about this is that we've got some actual biomechanics telling us this quite detailed picture of T-Rex ecology. And to think about T-Rex hunting prey, invites questions about, well, what did they actually eat? And we know a lot about this because Tyrannosaurus, they've got a very strong jaw, as do all Tyrannosaurids. And that means that they leave lots of bite marks in things in bones when they are eating carcasses. And so we find things like Triceratops hips that are riddled with bite marks, and the bones of duck-billed dinosaurs have got two scrapes and nibbling marks on them where they're getting at the flesh in between in between the sort of recesses of a skeleton. So we find there's lots of diversity in how they're foraging. And including that also includes that they were eating the bones or eating the remains of other T-Rexes. So we know that they're also cannibals. And there's lots we could talk about here, but obviously we need to pay attention to time. But I will mention my favorite thing about T-Rex foraging, which actually concerns some unusual marks around the back of the heads of Triceratopses. So this big dinosaur with this big frill around the back of its skull. And there are scrape marks on Triceratops frills. And so far as we're aware, there would really be nothing to eat on that part of a Triceratops. It's probably just going to be skin, scaly skin over the frill of a Triceratops. And But equally, there's also some peculiar tooth marks around the back of Triceratops heads. So where the neck would attach to the skull, we also see that Tyrannosauruses are eating from that part of the body. And it's thought that these two sets of bite marks might actually be correlated, because the only way you can start eating around the very back of the head is if you've taken the head off. So is Tyrannosaurus actually using the frill of Triceratops? And there's a little bit of a trigger warning coming up here, slight bit of gore on the next slide. Is Tyrannosaurus using the frill of Triceratops to actually lever off the head of these animals so it can then access all of the neck muscles? Triceratops heads are huge. They have a lot of muscle to hold them in place, and that's going to be good eating. You know, if you've had the other parts of a carcass, you've had the more accessible saws, and you've had the organs, the next thing you're going to be looking for are the next biggest set of muscles. And in Triceratops, that's definitely going to be the neck. And I think this is really awesome. That number one, we can say this with with some confidence about how extinct animals behaved. But also just because it's a reminder of why these giant extinct animals are so interesting. I mean, there's plenty to be said about smaller dinosaurs and smaller extinct animals in general, but it's sometimes nice just to be reminded of the scale that these animals existed at, and what that enabled them to do. These two elephant-sized animals literally pulling each other apart is a pretty awesome thing to think about. We also know that Tyrannosauruses were that Tyrannosaurus, I should say, when they weren't eating carcasses, they were also quite happy to turn their attention to one another, and they engaged in what we call face biting. And we think they're doing this to settle disputes. So when Tyrannosauruses come to blows, we know that they are specifically biting one another in the face. And we've got lots and lots of evidence for that, not just in Tyrannosaurus, but in predatory dinosaurs in general. So this seems to be something that is common to the entire group, and they don't stop doing this. Interestingly, these predatory dinosaurs don't stop doing this until the evolution of feathers, and that might be something to do with feathers taking over and performing more of a display function. And there's so much we could talk about with T-Rex, but really the last thing I want to emphasize is that one conversation you've seen around Tyrannosaurus recently, if you follow dinosaur news, is a question of how many species of T-Rex actually existed. There are several major theories, or major hypotheses, I should say, about how we might have more than one Tyrannosaurus species existing in the same time and place in Cretaceous North America. One of them is this idea that there is a small Tyrannosaurus called Nanotyrannus, which is meant to be sort of a dwarf species, a smaller species of Tyrannosaur that lived alongside T-Rex. There are ideas that Tyrannosaurus is a lineage of species. Oh, sorry, there's an idea that Tyrannosaurus rex is a lineage of Tyrannosaurus-like animals that split into two, and there's actually three species within the fossils that we normally call T-Rex. So there'll be Tyrannosaurus imperator, Tyrannosaurus rex proper, and another thing called T. regina. And then most recently, I should say, there was a specimen that was historically been viewed as Tyrannosaurus that has now been reclassified as something called Tyrannosaurus macraensis. And this is a geologically older, relatively slender-jawed species of Tyrannosaurus. And all of these ideas are in various states of acceptance and debate within Tyrannosaur science. So Nanotyrannus is going through a bit of an upswing. It's sort of been ignored for many, many years, but there's some things in the works that maybe people are thinking it might be valid again. The middle idea about Tyrannosaurus imperator, regina, that kind of complex evolving lineage, I think that's been pretty well shut down now. That doesn't seem to be standing up to scientific scrutiny. Tyrannosaurus macraensis, that's very new, very recent, so it's difficult to say, how accepted that has been. Early signs are that it might stand up to scientific scrutiny, but we'll see. Why on earth, 120 years after we discovered T-Rex, why on earth are we still talking about it? And I'm going to race through these slides because I'm aware I've been talking a bit too long. One reason is that Tyrannosaurus is a very geographically widespread animal. We've already said it exists all the way out from Alberta, right the way down to almost into Mexico. It also occurs over an uncertain geological range. So we don't actually know when T-Rex first appears in the geological record. We know when it goes extinct, but we don't know when it first appears. Across this geological and geographic span, there is a lot of scope for different T-Rex species to be appearing and evolving. And the important thing is that we just bear that in mind when we're looking at their specimens. It's not a guarantee that they are all going to be T-Rex proper. There might be some more diversity in there, particularly in some of the geologically older specimens. And the other thing, of course, that we've already introduced is that Tyrannosaurus changes so much with growth. And this is actually a really remarkable thing about T-Rex, is that this is something we should talk about as much as their bite force and their size and their running speed, etc. It's how much T-Rex changes with growth. So T-Rex grew relatively rapidly. They get to full size in about 20 years, but there's a growth spur in their teenage years, which accounts for most of that size increase and accumulation of mass. But this is one reason why we think why we have found several species that are then shown to be invalid. It's because they change so much throughout growth, and you can imagine how much variation there must be between all of these different growth. The people look at fossils and go, "Oh, this must be something new," but actually it's just, "Oh no, we haven't found what an 18-year-old T-Rex looks like yet," and actually that slots into our growth system quite nicely. But the thing to emphasize about T-Rex growth and to kind of move on from the idea of it being just being a source of variation is that we also need to vary our interpretation of T-Rex in our minds. So when we're thinking about Tyrannosaurus as juveniles, they are completely different animals to what they're like as adults. They are going to be much, much faster. They're tiny, for one thing. They're about a meter long when they first hatch out of their eggs. And they're going to spend much of their lives chasing after prey, fueling their growth. They, of course, themselves are going to be prey for other large predators, including perhaps other Tyrannosauruses. We don't know. But certainly at this point, this is a completely polarized a completely polarized ecology to what it's like as a big adult T-Rex. As they grow bigger, of course, that ecology changes again because they're no longer quite so vulnerable to predators, and they can begin to chase bigger prey. They might become faster in terms of because they're much because they're bigger. They get a better power to weight ratio with their limbs, and maybe they're able to start chasing down very quick dinosaurs like the ostrich dinosaurs. And so there's a shift in ecology there. We have to think that a teenage T-Rex is also quite different to an adult, and it's only when we get to it's only when we get to the last third of T-Rex life cycles that they attain the giant form that we know of that we think of as T-Rex. So it's when we're thinking about this animal, we really need to think of it not just as this one form. We need to think about it as a number of different growth stages, if you like. And there is so much else we could talk about with Tyrannosaurus. Here's some of the things I would like to have included in this talk, but of course we've only got a number of minutes. We don't have hours and hours and hours. And of course, there's all the cultural issues around T-Rex as well. We haven't had time to go into them. The thing I will emphasize to you is that the fossil animal T-Rex is way more interesting than anything you will see on the cinema screen. And this is what I thoroughly encourage you to go and learn about. It's T-Rex as we understand it by science, and not through the vision of hype and big media. And of course, if you'd like to know more about T-Rex, then there is a whole book that you can go and buy about it. And I'll finish there because I know we've got some questions to answer. So thanks very much for listening, and I apologize about the technical issues in the talk there. But thanks very much.
Wow, thanks so much, Mark. Such a huge amount of ground covered, and as someone with a paleontology background, but obviously now working in museums, it's all about how to sort of get that current science into the popular sort of sphere and help people to understand it. And that is just brilliant. You covered so much ground there. We do have a few questions, which is good. I've got loads of things I was writing notes all over the place, but people have put some questions in our little Q&A box here, so we will go through some of those. So the first question is from Etta. Is it possible to sex dinosaurs?
It is very, very difficult to do this, and so that there are some sources out there that will say you can just look at a dinosaur's bones, and T-Rex is the example of this. They will say you can have a look at a T-Rex skeleton and say whether it's male or female just by looking at the bones. You can't. That is the honest truth. There are ideas that, like, there's parts of the anatomy of the hips and of the tail that might tell you something about what sex a dinosaur is. The only possible way we have of determining whether a dinosaur is a female. So we can't identify males, but we might be able to identify females that are producing eggs. And this is because within their bones, there is a distinctive bone tissue that develops during the phase of egg creation. And so when we find that, that has to be a female, because of course males are not creating eggs. The problem with this is that it only occurs during egg production. So it's something that even you could chop up 100 T-Rex leg bones, and you would find some of that bone tissue in some of them, and the rest you wouldn't. And the ones you didn't find it in, you wouldn't know if they're male or female. This is a very rare bone tissue, and that's about the only way we can tell sex in dinosaurs at the moment. And the thing to emphasize is that even that is a little bit controversial. There are some people who are a bit uncertain about it. But yeah, certainly if someone says I've got like a female Tyrannosaurus specimen on display, they can't know that. There is no way to tell that from fossils.
Thank you. So the next question is, which part of the world today has the most T-Rex skeletons? I think you touched on this on the talk, so this might be a snappier thing to be able to answer.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of where you find them in the world, they are exclusively found in Western North America. And North America is also the place with the most T-Rexes in their museums. You can go on a tour, and in fact, I did this for making the book. You can go on a tour of museums, and you're just going to go in city to city, and there's a different T-Rex specimen in every one. So Western North America is where you get the fossils, and America is a good place to go and see their specimens. But we also have them on display in places like Oxford, Edinburgh, Manchester. So you can go and see T-Rex specimens in the UK as well if you want to go and see a big skeleton. And every now and then they also tour. So they're like rock stars. Every now and then people like do a little exhibit with T-Rex skeletons. So yeah, they might actually come to somewhere close to you at some point soon.
Yes, I think there was one in Nottingham recently, which actually might have come back. I can't remember, but yes, they are rock stars, aren't they? In several senses of the word. So they're
Yep.
never too far away from one, are you? Next question. This is a good one. How did you get into dinosaur illustration?
Oh, so I've always drawn pictures of things, and part of that as a child was drawing dinosaurs and other prehistoric animals. And like most people who are into paleontology, just that part of me never grew up, and I've just always remained remained interested in them. And I just kept drawing them. So it's always been a hobby of mine to draw. I never actually thought I would go into becoming, sort of a professional illustrator or artist. And my trajectory into paleontology was via the academic routes. So, I went to university to study paleontology, and I have my PhD in paleontology. But when I finished that, I found that people were hiring me to do illustrations, and I was writing books and illustrating them myself, and so I sort of fell into it in a way. Yeah, so it's something that I never thought I would be doing, to make a living out of. But if you want to pay me to draw dinosaurs, I mean, I'm absolutely fine. If and it seems to be working. So the whole thing is sort of a bit made up as I've gone along. But yeah, it's something that seems to be going all right at the minute.
So next question, do we know if T-Rex was a lone hunter or hunted in packs?
So I've known this question was going to come. This is a really, really sought after question about T-Rex. So do we know if they lived in groups or not? I'm going to try and answer this succinctly because it's a big, complicated area. The challenge with identifying group living in dinosaurs is you've got to prove a number of things. Number one, that the two or more specimens come from the same geological layer. If they do, you have to prove that they both died at the same time and that they were both preserved in similar sort of circumstances. And then most difficult of all, you have to prove that they're actually living together and not just together for another purpose, like a big congregation of animals because of a glut of food or a drought, concentrating animals in one particular area. So can we do that with T-Rex? We do have sites where we have more than one Tyrannosaurus found, but there's only one site where this has been done, been demonstrated confidently, and this is the place where Sue was discovered. Sue was found with at least 3 other Tyrannosauruses. So there's small. They're all smaller than Sue. I mean, Sue's one of the biggest T-Rexes. They have to be smaller than Sue, but they're all very piecemeal bones. So Sue is a big, complete specimen. And the other T-Rex that were found with that specimen are things like a bit of a skull or a claw. And so what this suggests is that while they might all be found in the same quarry, They may all have been preserved in the same place, more or less at the same time. The history of how those body parts got there, you've got to think about a fossil once as a rotting carcass. And the history of how those bits of Tyrannosaurus got there is probably quite different. So Sue must have died close to where the specimen was preserved, because virtually all the bones are there. But when you've just got a bit of a skull, who knows how that got in there? That rolled in there at another point or was washed in by a flood from elsewhere. So probably the only site we have where we find more than one T-Rex, that's probably an artificial assemblage of T-Rex bones rather than Tyrannosaurus living together. Now there are other Tyrannosaurids that may have been alive and associating with one another. But then you get to that third step of, well, just because we found all of these animals together in one area and they may have been, dying together, why were they actually together? Were they actually living in groups? Were they hunting in groups? Or were they congregating for another purpose? And I don't think anyone has come up with a way of convincingly demonstrating that for predatory dinosaurs yet. We can kind of do it a little bit for herbivorous dinosaurs. When you find thousands of duck-billed dinosaurs or thousands of horned dinosaurs in one bedding plane, that's clearly a big herd of these animals that was moving through one place. That's not just a chance association. So you can do it for enormous bone beds of herbivorous dinosaurs, but for the big carnivores, I don't think it's yet been convincingly demonstrated that they are living in groups. And that's not to say that they didn't. And that's an important caveat. It's not to say that they didn't do this. It's just, what does the science tell us? It's not demonstrated it yet.
Thank you. We're almost up to time, but two people have asked about the same thing. So I wonder if you could answer the question, basically from Laura, who has said, "Do we know what color T-Rex was?" It's such a popular question. Can you give us an answer in, say, 20 seconds?
I can try. Every single large predator today, whether it's a shark, a terrestrial carnivore like a lion or a tiger, or a big carnivorous reptile, a large raptorial bird, they are all adapted for camouflage. So they are all about remaining inconspicuous. So you often see pictures of big predatory dinosaurs with lots of bright display colors on them. In my view, that is completely inconsistent with the colors that you see on the largest carnivores around today. So if I were to put money on this, and I do actually talk about this a lot in the book. If I was to put money on this, I would say that Tyrannosaurus was probably quite drably colored to blend in with its surroundings.
It's so often the way, isn't it? People want them to be sort of blue with pink spots, but actually they're living, functioning animals that need to function in the environment that they're in. So
exactly. The thing to remember is that dinosaurs didn't care what we think about them. So they're not concerned about being boring looking, or drab. It's like, what's going to help me get to that Edmontosaurus so I can get dinner this evening? Being drab is going to help it a lot more than, being as elaborate as a peacock.
absolutely. There are a few other questions that they keep coming in, so I'm really sorry. We're going to have to, we've run over very slightly, so thank you for sticking with us, and thank you for amazing, fascinating talk, Mark. I have a copy of the book here, and it is really accessible. Really, all the science is in there. It's all, lots of accessible illustrations, diagrams, fantastic stuff. If you'd like to know more, you can pick it up from foxlanebooks.co.uk, who's a partner of the festival. So thank you for the talk, and thank you for answering those questions as well.